Welcome to Life Happens, where Texans come to protect their legacy and prepare for the second half of life. Join your host, attorney Kim Hegwood of Your Legacy Legal Care, and our weekly guest as we navigate the challenges that emerge as life happens. Now here's your host, Kim Hegwood.
Good morning and welcome to Life Happens with me, Kim Hegwood, and our very special guest today is Edla Prevette. Good morning.
Hi, how are you, Kim? Thanks for having me.
And I appreciate it because we're going to talk about some good stuff today. We're going to talk about how to talk to your aging parents about difficult topics. And so, because a lot of times parents don't like to talk about difficult topics. And
Yes.
so, I'm always laughing, telling people we talk about everything in my family, so it's never an issue. We're a talking bunch, and
Yeah.
so. But what do you find is that some of the biggest challenges adult children face, when they're caring for aging parents while managing their own lives?
Well, right. I think the biggest challenges, one would be communication, just like you said, and we can dive into that a little bit more. But I think just the overwhelm, especially if they're sandwich, if they're in a sandwich generation. So if they're caring for children or they're still working full time and caring for their aging parents, I think just the overwhelm of the to-do list, the personal responsibilities. A lot of caregivers are dealing with their own personal health issues, especially since the majority of caregivers are women. You've got perimenopause and menopause that they're dealing with, if not some of their own issues. So I would say overwhelm is a big one. I would also say patience. And part of they're impatient because of lack of time and the responsibilities, but then also because sometimes they don't understand what's happening with their aging parent and they get frustrated with them. It's like, why are you asking me this? You've always done it that way. So some not understanding sort of the typical ages or developmental stages of aging, I think, contribute to that challenge with being patient as their parents age. I would say those are the two biggies.
So, what types of conversations are important and also difficult when you're talking about, with aging parents? I mean, I have a pretty good idea in my head, but I'm curious to know what what you
Well, I
think.
think the interesting thing is that when I'm asked this question or when this comes up, the obvious things come up. As an attorney, you of course know that it's important to talk about your will and about your power of attorney and all of that. It's important to talk about your financial situation. It's important to talk about your possessions and your living arrangements. And obviously, those are important things to talk about. But as a mental health therapist, I think it's equally as important to talk about what are your wishes? What are your hopes? How do you want the rest of this time to look? Because the list of things, the finances, the possessions, the living arrangements, all of that, that's just the cognitive, that's just the to do list, right? But it's very emotional. And we don't really take any time to kind of consider the emotional implications of this, right? And it's interesting when you start thinking about having these conversations, it seems like people fall into two camps. They're either proactive, like you said, your family talks about everything, right? They're proactive about it, or they're kind of avoidant. And
Yeah.
it's not always the aging parent that's avoidant. Sometimes it's the adult child
Hmm.
that's avoidant because it's just too sad to think about what's next, right? And so there's the obvious list of conversations of things you want to talk about, but then there are those more subtle kind of emotional pieces that I think are equally as important. Maybe even before you launch into the other things, just to do that sort of the feeling piece and how am I feeling about this. So that would be the quick of that, to do a little reflection on that before you launch into all the check list of things to do.
We find that clients we find that clients a lot of times don't like to talk about,
Mhm.
they don't want to talk about, what happens if they can't stay at home anymore.
Right.
So, we do try to start having those conversations because we want them to talk to somebody so they know what to do.
Yeah.
So that's hugely important. But since we're talking about good communication stuff, what are some key communication strategies that caregivers can use to navigate those difficult, conversations with parents?
Right. Well, I've sort of it's a very nuanced thing, and it's very individual, depending on the circumstances between the adult children and the aging parents. But I think there's sort of three parts that are fundamentally true for everybody. And the first one is to be empathic. Really try to hear and understand what they're feeling, what they're going through, what they're worried about. So I think you've got to really start from a place of empathy and listening and compassion. Once you've done that, then people are generally better able to then look at problem solving, choices, coming up with solutions, right? Because they feel like they've really been heard and understood. And the way that you do that is to ask your parents, the aging parents, questions. What are you thinking about? I'm wondering how you're feeling about, and try to give them some autonomy into the process. But when caregivers are busy, they're like, okay, what do you want to do about this? And what do you want to do about that? And hurry up, we got to make a decision. And that'll break the conversation right down so quickly. And then the third step would be to really encourage and praise your parent for their willingness to have this conversation, even though it was stressful or hard or sad, right? Because it's really about connection, right? It's always about staying connected and staying true to your relationship, because when we're connected, we're more cooperative. I have like a workbook that I've put together that's free. It's on my website. I call it the 180 shift from frustration to confidence. And it identifies these steps in much more detail. It gives some examples, and then it gives practice sessions. And they're all examples of other clients I've worked through scenarios. So it should be really helpful for your audience. It's on the homepage of my website at edlaprevette.com. I think that that'll be in the show notes, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, great. Mm-hmm.
So, but how can caregivers set boundaries without feeling guilty?
Yeah, that one's kind of a tricky question, because people think that how do you set boundaries without being guilty? I say, where's the guilt coming from? That has to be the first step. If you're feeling guilty about setting boundaries or caring for your parents, kids, colleagues, doesn't matter. You got to really figure out where that guilt is coming from. It might be that you feel resentful. It might be that you have a family history. It might be some, dysfunctional relationships. It might be distance, right? And you can't be there. So I think first, sort of identifying where the guilt comes from. And then, because oftentimes when we can do that, then we address what's making us feel guilty. We work on that, and then setting boundaries can be a little bit easier. But when it comes to setting boundaries, once you've gotten to that place, I was my parents' caregiver for over 10 years. And it was every day. I mean, it was something every day. I was having to set a limit or set a boundary or make a decision. And what I had to really do is become clear and thoughtful about when I was going to set boundaries with them. So I always ask myself three questions. Are they financially safe? Are they physically safe? Are they mentally safe? And if the answer was no, I set a boundary, right? So if my mother wanted to go get her hair done and her nails done and, get hot dogs at the gas station or whatever, even though she didn't need to be eating hot dogs from the gas station, I didn't micromanage that, because she was financially safe, physically safe, and emotionally safe. So that just helped me when I felt stressed or overwhelmed or guilty. I kind of put on my parent hat like I did with my children when they were growing up, that, how I didn't love it, but you're responsible for these people and their well-being. So I would say, ask yourself those three questions. And if the answer is if they're not emotionally, physically, or financially safe, then you set a boundary.
Oh, that's good information.
Yep.
And so, but why is it so important for caregivers to be self-regulated, and how does that impact their ability, to care over the long haul?
Right. Well, when we're not self-regulated, and this is anybody, if you're not self-regulated, which means kind of your emotions being regulated, kind of centered, people that aren't regulated have a more difficult time making decisions, brainstorming, problem solving, communicating, because they're in such an emotional state, right? So the first thing is that you've got to figure out how to put support systems in place, right? You've got to have a team of people. And then you've got to have a mechanism for delegating things, because it's almost impossible to juggle it all. So like, you're an attorney, like my mother's attorney was part of my team, right? And if something was like, I don't know what to do about this, I would give her a call or shoot her an email, right? And that, yeah, it took an extra thing for me to do, but that wasn't my area of expertise. But that was her area of expertise. And it just immediately kind of regulated me. So I think having a system in place and having a team of people where you can kind of delegate and reach out.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you, because I just seen you call and let me fix the problem before it gets worse, or at least
Oh,
give you
yeah.
options to how to fix the
Yep.
problem before it
Yep.
gets worse. And so I'm blessed that, for in a sense, because I was a caregiver for my grandparents. So
Right.
I have the ability, so I've already been where a lot of clients are coming in,
Right.
doing so, having a little experience doesn't hurt these days.
Right. No, it
So,
doesn't. Yeah, because it gives you a perspective. And then the
mhm.
more people that you work with, like, I haven't had all of the experiences, but the more people you work with, you hear, oh, Sally and Bobby and all the different people, and it just adds to your collection of ability to be empathic and ability to coach people, which is a lot of what I do. Yeah.
So, what are some practical ways caregivers can develop emotional resilience and regulate their own stress levels? Because mine was pretty stressful.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna minimize it and say that there's any quick fix, because there is not. It can be a just brutal journey, right? And so the best way to regulate ourselves is to have self-care strategies in place. And a lot of people feel like, oh my God, I don't have time for any kind of self-care. And it feels like another thing they're adding to their plate. They're already full plate. And so I have to say, though, that that's how we get ourselves back in our window of tolerance. If we're hyper aroused or hypo aroused, we've got to do something to regulate ourselves. And the way that we do that are these self-care strategies. I'm going to assume the audience is familiar with some of those: exercising, eating right, sleeping right, taking a bath, things like that. And I would say, put it on your calendar as if it was a doctor's appointment. Put it on your calendar as if it was your kid's ball game, even if it's only once a week, right? But really, the thing that I think is the most helpful is what I call self-care snacks. A self-care snack is something that can be done in 5 or 10 minutes, right? And so if you think about your savings account, if you put $5, $10, $20, $5, $10, $20, eventually, you're going to have a little nest egg there. Well, self-care snacks can act the same way. If you've only got 5 or 10 minutes, take the 5 or 10 minutes. I actually have a resource that I created because I was getting so much pushback about self-care. And I get it, because I kind of hate hearing my own self talk about it. But I created a thing about self-care snacks and how to use them. And those are on my website too. But the idea is, it's like a little deposit. And one of my favorite ones, kind of how I came up with this idea, was my parents lived in like a continuing care community. And I went down there every day or every other day. And my mother would generally call me with the crisis of the day. And so my anxiety, I'd be kind of dysregulated, if you will. So every day when I got to the place, I sat in the car, I took some deep breaths, and I had these things in my glove box, which are just basically positive affirmation statements. And I'd pull them out and I'd read them. You've got this. You can do hard things. You want to be your parent's caregiver. Take some deep breaths, those kinds of things. And that was a self-care snack. I just regulated myself. So when I went in, I knew that I was in the best place that I could be at the time, whether to talk to mom off the ledge about something, or to talk to one of her caregiver, her in-home caregivers, or to talk to her attorney, or to talk to her doctor, or to talk to the financial guy, all the people. So there's a lot of ways to inject self-care snacks that are much more manageable and super helpful, because it's just a little bit, it's usually easy for people to access.
Well, that's good information. So can you tell us a quick success story about someone you've worked with that enabled them to have find that balance in their caregiving role?
Yes. The person that comes to mind is a woman named Amanda. And interestingly enough, I met Amanda. She's a therapist also. So we met in a business perspective. And she's an only child, and her parents, they both had failing health, and they lived in sort of a rural area. So Amanda, she loves them so much. She didn't have anger toward them, which is often, there's often some resentment and anger, but she had so much love and care. But she also had a young child, because she had her child later in life, and not a lot of resources. And so really, Amanda had done all the things, she was checking off all the things on the list, like I talked about earlier. But when I sat down with her and I was empathic, and I talked about how hard this was, and I talked about that, she could do this. And then we really looked at what she had in place and where the holes were, and what she really realized through that process. A couple of things that stand out. One is she, not intentionally, but she kept trying to get them back to normal. She kept trying to make them well again. She kept trying to fix them. She hadn't gone through a level of acceptance of they are at the end of their life, whether that be 10 years or 2 years, right? And so that's called anticipatory grief. So we had to work on some of that. Once she did that, and then we talked about the developmental stages of aging, which people don't, I can just go on and on about that. They read about the developmental stages of little kids, but not about, the aging population. And we talked about that communication of being empathic with her. She really turned it around with both of her parents. And so her dad ended up not living very long after I met her, maybe a year that I worked with her. But that last year, when she was having to make decisions about moving her dad out of the home, she was better able to get her mom on board. She was better able to get her dad on board, because some of these strategies that we put in place, and she's still caring for her mother now. So I would say that felt good to me. That was a good one. I have lots of them, but that's one that really stood out. I think because the assumption that because she was a therapist that she'd know all this, right? And she just didn't. Just like you as a caregiver and as an attorney, there's a lot that but when sometimes it comes down to our own people, we don't always have the same perspective.
Well, there's a lot I didn't know. It was hands-on training, so
yeah.
Yeah.
Me too. And that's why I do what I do, because I was like, wow, if I could pay this forward, if I could support someone on this journey, because there's not as many people doing this kind of work, not this sort of, I'll call it under the mental health, the parenting, the day-to-day kind of support. There's not a ton out there on helping people. So that was kind of how I pivoted in my private practice, was to help more sandwich generation adults.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, if any of our listeners want to find you and so that they can get some coaching, how do they do that?
EdlaPrevette.com. Everything is there. I do speaking engagements. I do coaching. I do therapy for anyone in North Carolina that feels like they need a little something else. I have some free and low cost offers. I have a pretty active mailing list where I give tips and share blogs and things like that. And all of that can be accessed on EdlaPrevette.com.
Perfect. Well, I just want to thank you so much for being on the
Sure.
show. It's good information, and we look
Yeah.
forward to having you on again soon.
All right. You take care. Have a good day.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Life Happens with Kim Hegwood. Be sure to tune in every Thursday at 10 a.m. wherever you listen to your podcast as we navigate through the challenges that emerge as life happens. The content of this podcast does not establish an attorney-client relationship or constitute attorney-client privilege, legal, medical, financial, or any other professional advice.